In this video, we're going to expand on our discussion of sensation to talk about two concepts. One is sensory adaptation, and the other is something that's often confused with sensory adaptation. It's called habituation. But before we start, I want you to think about getting into a cold pool. What happens after a while? At first you get in, you're freezing, then all of a sudden it starts to feel not so cold. So why is that? We know the temperature of the water has not actually changed. The temperature of the pool, the water in the pool that is, remains constant. But what happens is that the sense receptors on your skin that are responsible for responding to cold get tired. So as they're sensing that cool water, think of them as their firing action potentials. They're firing until they tire out and they don't fire as much. We call this process sensory adaptation. Think about a time when maybe you were out playing in the snow. Maybe you were little out playing in the snow, or you went on a ski trip or something. You come in the house, you go to run your hands under water, and it's just lukewarm water, but that water feels so hot. That's because when you were outside in the cold, these cold receptors became less responsive. And that means they're underactive, whereas your warm receptors are acting just as they should, but making the water feel a lot hotter than it actually is. So sensory adaptation is a loss of responsiveness in our receptor cells after stimulation has remained constant or unchanged for a while. So again, if we look back to those sense receptors in our skin, our thermoreceptors, when we're in that cold pool, these cold receptors start to lose their responsiveness, which is why we don't feel the cold anymore after a while. It's why you might walk into your house and the house has a particular smell and you're like, oh my gosh, what is that? Maybe you cooked something, a little bit smelly, left and came back. Oh my gosh, that smell. Well, after a little while, you're not going to notice it anymore. It's because of loss of responsiveness in the receptor cells in your nose that are responsible for your sense of smell. Habituation is different from sensory adaptation. Habituation happens not at the level of your sense receptors, but it actually happens in your brain. Habituation is learned. When you learn to not respond to a stimulus that is repeatedly presented to you, we call that habituation. So an example of habituation might be if this applies in my old house. I used to live on a really busy road. We never noticed the traffic. But when people came to look at the house, the number one feedback we got over and over again was the sound of the traffic. I don't know what they wanted us to do. What kind of feedback is that? Hey, let me just move this house for you so you'll want to buy it. But the point is, we stopped noticing it. We learned to ignore it. So again, where does learning occur? Learning occurs in the cerebral cortex, in that outer layer of the brain. If I'm living on a busy road, that constant sound, I shouldn't say constant. If I'm living on a busy road, that repeated traffic that's going by, as long as there's no negative consequence, as long as a car doesn't actually come up and drive onto my front lawn, I'm going to learn to ignore it. Now, if a car actually one time drove up onto my front lawn or into the front of my house, you can bet I'm going to be more likely to notice the sound of that traffic. But an organism will likely learn to stop responding to a stimulus that is presented repeatedly. One more example of habituation, and the reason I have these kids jumping up and down yelling cookies, 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 is because think about if you live in a house where cookies are banned. You can only have cookies on special occasions. What's going to happen when cookies are in the house? You're going to want cookies. You're going to want to eat the whole package of cookies because you don't know when the next time is that you're going to get them again. But what if cookies are just in the house all the time? Right? You become habituated to them. You probably are going to forget that they're even there after a while. I mean, sure, at first you might eat a package of them in a sitting, but after a while you're going to ignore them. So there's an anti-dieting, an anti-diet movement called intuitive eating. And that's kind of the basis of intuitive eating, is that the more we restrict foods and the more we make foods off limits, the more we crave them. Whereas the more we just allow ourselves to eat what we want when we're hungry, the less we're going to feel the need to binge on foods that we've restricted. So just kind of a different example, or habituation with a different spin.